When a car has been in an accident, the repair costs are expensive, especially if it's a German car. Now imagine with me if it's a German car and it's literally on fire and burned. How much do you expect the repair costs to be? That's what we'll see in today's video. First, make sure you're subscribed here, and let's broadcast a burnt German YouTuber. American YouTuber Joe James decided to buy his dream car, a 2023 BMW M Competition, but something big happened to it. He supposedly bought it at a Copart auction. It wasn't on fire or anything, just had a minor accident. He bought it for $48,000, had a small dent, and would easily return to its original condition. But the shock came just 2 hours after he took possession. He had parked it in front of his house when suddenly an unknown person decided to end his dream and set the whole car on fire. Here we see how many natural fires happened that day. Smoke filled the place and the fire was consuming everything. Joe was terrified, especially since he didn't have a fire extinguisher nearby. He just stood there, helplessly watching it burn. So now we come to the question everyone is asking. Where's the insurance? Unfortunately, Joe didn't insure the copy. The reason for this is that he's still young and it's very difficult for him to get dealer insurance. Also, the car had been in an accident and was practically scrap, so he didn't think he needed insurance. It was just sitting in front of his house, not moving. He made a few feeble attempts to contact insurance companies, but of course they refused to compensate him, because the copy he had was very valuable and the details of the fire weren't included in the contract. When he contacted the company to get his due compensation, they simply told him there was nothing they could do for him because the cameras hadn't captured the culprit's face clearly and they couldn't legally and definitively link it to the car he escaped in. So the culprit got away with his crime without anyone being able to catch him. But despite all this, Joe didn't give up and decided to restore it to like-new condition, despite the accident and the fire. After he put out the fire, only the front part was burned, but the back was still damaged. The mechanics started preparing the car for the crane to tow it. Its suspension system was completely destroyed, and he was afraid that when the crane started pulling, the warped wheel would tear off the rear bumper and damage the remaining intact carbon fiber parts. So he decided to quickly remove the bumper before the crane arrived and transported it to the workshop to begin work immediately. He lifted it and removed the exhaust and the protective covers underneath to access the engine and suspension. They discovered that the rims had warped from the accident and the heat. The real problem began when they found the aluminum parts melted on the steel bolts. This made removing the bolts a nightmare because everything was welded together by the fire. He started to remove the front end to clear space and be able to remove the engine and transmission all at once. But unfortunately, the fire had done its work on the front, to the point that they had to forcefully brake and reattach the headlights because they were completely melted. Surprisingly, they found coolant. It's still in the cooling system, despite everything that happened. After they finished with the front, they moved on to the rear suspension system. They removed the shock absorbers, ABS hoses, and brake sensors and found a small crack in the suspension. The car was practically brand new underneath because it only had 16,000 miles on it. He went to eBay to check prices. The completely burned out engine would cost around $1,400 and the transmission would be the same price. The front differential was $550 and the rear one would be $1,100. A single catalytic converter was $830 and the trunk lid was $690 because it's made of carbon fiber. He found one of the taillights for $480, and there's some other large parts and panels that would cost around $1,500. So he's calculating it randomly, and the total cost of the parts he needs separately will be around $10,000. He also asked about the price of it would cost an additional $20,000. Joe went inside and removed the leather seats, upholstery, and electronic components. The problem was with the electric seats, and since the wiring harness was burned, these seats couldn't move forward or backward. This meant he couldn't reach the screws holding the seats to the floor, so he had to get an angle grinder and cut through the metal of the seats themselves and their mounting brackets to reach the screws and remove them. He removed the dashboard, the center console, and the air conditioning unit, which was just a piece of plastic. After removing the burnt carpet, he discovered another disaster. The car was flooded inside. This water was the result of the fire hoses spraying a huge amount of water to extinguish the fire. First, he got rid of the water using the drain plug in the floor and collected it all in a bucket. But of course it wasn't easy because the water had flooded the entire floor, creating mud and ash. We were almost able to see the floor level with the metal. He removed everything. Even the M4D's suspension and all of its computers was replaced, and since it had previously carried the engine and suspension system, it was now just a sheet of metal with no wheels or movement to transport it to another location. He came up with a small invention. Pipes welded together, and he found a rubber wheel he bought from eBay for about $50. He welded the wheel to the pipes and made a handle to pull it. Surprisingly, this invention actually worked and carried the weight of the entire chassis naturally. Now we entered a completely different problem, the carbon fiber roof. This roof alone is very expensive, but unfortunately the sun completely destroyed it. He grabbed a hammer and chisel and started removing the hood, peeling it off piece by piece. The sight of him breaking the roof was heartbreaking for anyone who loves M Sport, but there was no other solution. He discovered that the shock absorber tower or shock absorber base and part of the chassis in the M4D were made entirely of aluminum, and the melting point of aluminum is very high, around 600 degrees. It was only a few degrees Celsius, but compared to iron, which can reach 1300 degrees, he started to remove all the melted aluminum parts. Of course, it wasn't easy because these parts were held together with spot welds. He had very strong rivets everywhere, so he started drilling holes in the joints and hammering with a chisel to separate the parts. BMW uses very special bolts to join aluminum to iron because these two metals don't weld together. Since he didn't have the special tools for these bolts, he went and got an angle grinder and made a hole in the head of the bolt. Then he used a regular screwdriver to loosen them as if they were ordinary bolts. After he removed the pieces, the true extent of the damage became clear. The chassis on the passenger side was completely melted, and on the driver's side, the shock absorber tower was so brittle that you could pierce it with a screwdriver. It was literally like fire paper. This completely weakened the aluminum. He used an electric saw to cut a section and continued his battle with the rivets holding the chassis together. These rivets, or rivetonics, are made of very strong steel and could easily damage the sockets of a very expensive 8-pole drill just to destroy a single rivet. After he had removed all the bolts, the rivets he managed to use were now ready for cutting and trimming. He decided to cut away the entire front section, which was completely ruined. He used an angle grinder as a reciprocating saw and worked his way through the layers of metal, one after another. At the same time, he also received spare parts, a completely new front end. This part came with its brackets, or the entire chassis, including the turret and all the original factory welds, so he could later identify it as being fitted to the burned body. To fit it onto the burned body, he first had to clean the old weld area to remove the layers of burnt paint, rust, soot, and dust that filled the space. This was the most important step, so that when he welded or bonded the new parts, the metal would hold together properly and never come apart. He started by spraying the first protective layer using a special type of paint called oxide primer, which was red. This layer was the first line of defense against rust and corrosion. He sprayed it on every exposed piece of metal on the front. The look was completely transformed, and from that moment, Joe began to feel that the impossible was starting to become a reality. He took a chassis part from another BMW i4 to get the exact piece he needed. These parts are sealed with sealant and held in place by many rivets, as we saw before in BMW repairs. He took an angle grinder and started peeling away the sealant to reach the screw heads and rivets so he could remove them in the same way he did on his original car. To separate the parts, he used a specialized machine to heat the strong adhesive that BMW uses at the factory. He spent some time heating and applying pressure with a chisel and hammer until the part came out in his hand. He removed it and cleaned off the remaining adhesive and old paint so it was ready to be welded and installed in his car. He went back inside the cabin and started sanding every part of the interior, even the pipes that supported the roof. The fire had literally filled every inch of the car with soot and ash, but he was determined to clean it all up. He got a vacuum cleaner and started cleaning all the dirt that had accumulated inside. The cleaning was finished and he started the primer application. He sprayed a thick layer of primer on the parts not exposed to the elements, like the interior floor and the car's headliner.
Unfortunately, the engine he disassembled looked awful. All the plastic on it, the cover, the intake manifold, and even the air coolers was melted plastic over the metal. Luckily, he discovered that the gearbox was in excellent condition and almost undamaged. The engine, however, needed a lot of work. Here, we see him exert a great deal of effort to remove the intake manifold because the screws were buried under layers of plastic to the point that he didn't even know where they were. There were 2 turbochargers here, which he removed, and they were quite large. Naturally, he'd sell the whole engine and buy a new one, as repairing it would be nearly impossible. He wanted to get all the spare parts at the lowest possible cost, so he didn't want to buy new expensive parts from the dealership right now. His plan was that he's waiting to find a salvage car, a recent model from 2023 onwards, so he can take everything from it, like the suspension system, wiring harness, dashboard, and control arms. The problem is that this model at the time of filming was still relatively new, and it's difficult to find one that's been in a recent accident. The challenge now is to find one from 2023, 2024, or even 2025, but that will be very expensive just so he can take the dashboard and install it. He already knows the wiring harness alone will cost him $5,500, and the aluminum chassis arm will cost him $830 each. And imagine, a tube of BMW adhesive will cost him another $270, and he needs several tubes to glue and rivet all the chassis parts because the car's frame and construction don't use welding. They're currently working on preparing the frame, sanding and painting it, but he's waiting for the chassis arm. The second one will come from the dealership so he can install it. After that, they'll paint the entire body, and that will complete the structural repairs. The car will be transformed from mere scrap metal into a frame ready for components. They removed the old damaged chassis legs and prepared compressed sand for cleaning. They sprayed a protective primer and also applied a black layer to protect the body from scratches and give it an extra layer of protection. While he was working, what he was waiting for suddenly appeared, a second M4 that had been in a terrible accident and was up for auction. It was completely wrecked, but he needed the passenger side chassis leg and, if he could, the rear fender and ideally a carbon fiber roof. From the auction photos, he knew that the bucket seats might be available, and if he found them in good condition, he'd definitely take them because they're a treasure in themselves. He dismantled the entire rear suspension system and replaced a shock absorber that was broken the same day he received the car. The rear part was on fire, he didn't touch it, but he has to unscrew all the screws to replace the wiring harness. This harness runs from the front of the engine to the trunk at the back. Since the front harness is burnt out, he has to replace the entire wire from beginning to end.
He bought the car that was up for auction. He went to a place that was essentially a car dismantling yard. He walked around and saw all the wrecked cars and their classifications. This classification meant they wouldn't be registered again. They would be cut up and sold for parts, but they were forbidden from being registered or driven on the road again. Amidst the chaos, he spotted the car he'd bought. It was probably stuck in a tree because the impact was so violent that the dashboard was pushed into the engine compartment. Imagine the force that could have caused the dashboard to shift and move forward like that. The first thing he focused on was the roof. If he'd bought a new one from the dealership, it would have cost him around $7,600. He was terrified it might be cracked or warped from the accident, especially since it was so powerful, as was evident. But after inspecting the roof, he found it was in excellent condition, almost 100% intact. The second thing he definitely checked was the seats. The cheapest used set sold for around $1,000. So let's move on to the rear. It was completely undamaged, but he didn't need it for anything. He thought about selling the parts he didn't need to recoup the money he'd paid for the car. For example, the rear bumper could fetch $700, and the taillights could do the same. The rear diffuser, around $130, was still unsure of its exact price, but it was definitely a respectable amount since it's all carbon fiber. The rear suspension system, for example, could be sold for $2,700 plus $100. Even the differential and exhaust system would benefit from them. The engine's condition wasn't clear in the photos, so he opened the hood to see exactly how far the impact extended. He found the oil cap was missing, which worried him that rainwater might have entered the engine and damaged it. However, he wouldn't know the details until he drained the oil and checked. He also noticed that the plastic valve cover was broken in a small spot due to the impact, but this was easily fixed and could be replaced.
What reassured him greatly was that the engine chassis or its mounts weren't damaged or destroyed. The impact was concentrated in a specific area and pushed the front of the car backwards. The transmission, however, was spared, the engine itself a metal block from the direct impact. There was a sensor, and the injector rail is damaged, but it's a minor issue and can be easily replaced with some disassembly and reassembly. They used a winch to pull the hood, which was stuck to the windshield, and also pulled the shock absorber tower forward a bit to create more space for themselves while they were removing it, as the metal was literally piled on top of each other. So the engine, carbon fiber roof, and seats are all fine. Only the seats had a very minor dent that can be easily repaired. He found that the radiators were largely intact and their pipes hadn't melted like what happened in his other burned car. He had already bought fenders and a differential hood before his car caught fire, so he wouldn't need the parts for this car and would sell them as well. The door here is intact, so he'll sell it too since he had bought another one. He tried to remove the doors, but he had the same problem. The electricity was completely cut off and the seats wouldn't move. He did the same thing he did before to expose the screws, so the interior was horribly damaged. He tried. They took everything apart inside, like the dashboard, center console, and even the seats. He got an external battery and a testing device and started trying to touch the wiring of the electric motor in the seat to get it moving and loosen the screws. Then he started removing the wheel architrave and discovered that it protected the brake caliper from the impact, which meant he saved about $400. He moved on to the doors and started removing the wiring harness and everything else that could be removed, even the air pressure sensors in the tires. After that, he moved on to removing the engine and transmission. He raised the car on axle stands and decided to remove the engine in the street because there wasn't a large hydraulic jack nearby. So before doing that, he had to remove a few other things. He started with the wheels and moved on to the exhaust, the front suspension, and even the radiator, which they found had a broken outer casing, but the internal components were intact. He spent about 15 minutes removing the connector. The electrical system connected to the ECU and distribution box was removed. After removing all the bolts connecting the engine to the transmission, he used a forklift to lift the car's body and let the engine, transmission, and suspension drop as one unit to the ground. Then he checked the oil drain plug to see if water had entered the engine due to cracks in the directional cover. Luckily, the oil came out completely clean, and the oil pipe was dry, which likely meant the engine was fine. He then removed the roof, rear fenders, interior upholstery, and literally every bolt, piece of plastic, and screw in the car to completely empty it. He removed the wiring harness in one piece, from beginning to end. Next, he used a saw to cut the rear quarter panel and left the rest of the chassis as scrap metal for the owner. Then he transported all the parts to a body shop to begin the process of installing the fenders and roof on his car. He didn't have the budget to send it to an expensive chemical cleaning shop, so he did everything himself, spending hours cleaning. Using a wire brush and sandpaper, he then applied undercoating to every part of the car's undercarriage to protect it from rust permanently. He also used wax oil and sprayed it inside the gaps until the oil started dripping from the openings, meaning the protection reached almost every corner. After the insulation, he started sealing all the openings with rubber plugs and extended the fuel lines running from the tank in the back to the engine in the front. He also connected the main electrical cable that runs from the battery in the trunk to the front. He also installed sound insulation in the rear fenders and brake lines. Here, we see him installing the entire wiring harness. After that, he placed the sound insulation in the partition between the engine and the cabin. The most important thing he did was use a drill to clean the paint from the floor areas to ensure proper electrical connection. He installed the new dashboard, the air conditioning unit, and the HD display screen. He also installed the rear seat belts and sound insulation under the seats and then laid the carpet underneath. Place and secure the ABS unit in the engine compartment and connect the brake lines.
The brake master was under immense pressure and extremely nervous because his version was expensive and he didn't want to make a single mistake. The engine hadn't been installed yet because he was waiting for a gasket for the valve stem seals as the old one was perforated. The dashboard was still at the upholsterer's and was undergoing special work. He reassembled the front of the car from two broken pieces to create a single undamaged one. The radiator was bent, so he disassembled it and worked on it by hand because it was weak and could be easily straightened. He also installed the plastic brackets in the trunk to secure the wiring harness and wires. He placed the final soundproofing in the engine compartment and the windshield washer fluid channels. He also installed something called an emergency water drain so that if the water level rose, it wouldn't flood the car. Now, let's look at the important part.
He brought the front subframe and tried to install it, which was a terrifying moment for him because if the screws didn't come out exactly in front of the holes, then all the previous bodywork would have been wrong and the car would practically be scrapped. But when he lifted it and found that the bolts went in without any problems and were perfectly aligned, he went to get a new valve cover and genuine BMW gaskets. After that, he vacuumed the valves and spark plug holes to ensure that nothing fell inside the engine while he was taking it apart. He removed the 6 ignition coils because this engine is definitely a 6-cylinder. He arranged them in order on the floor, cleaned the surface thoroughly, installed the new cover, and tightened the bolts in a star pattern, which is arranged from the inside out to ensure proper pressure distribution. However, he discovered that all the engine mounts were worn and cracked from the fire, so he would definitely replace them with new ones. He made a clever, albeit somewhat ingenious move. He assembled the subframe and the engine outside the car to easily lower them all at once. He tried lowering the engine with the subframe still attached, but it failed miserably. So he removed another subframe and attached it to the engine while it was suspended on the winch. He then used the winch to lift it and got a jack to support the transmission from behind so the engine would remain balanced as it was lowered. He carefully lowered the car from top to bottom and started adjusting the bolt positions until they were all aligned. Once he tightened the subframe bolts and the bolts that held the transmission, it finally became part of the car. He connected the fuel lines and installed the ECU. He went under the car to connect the drive shaft to the transmission and used very long cables to reach the bolts on top. He connected the ground cables and cleaned the contact points so the electrical system would work without any problems. He realized the transmission needed to be rewired to function, which unfortunately meant expenses. Furthermore, Joe had accidentally thrown away a brake pipe, thinking it was scrap. He was waiting for a new part from BMW to replace the discarded one. He installed metal brake pipes to improve braking performance and make the pedal stiffer and stronger. Then he installed a cooling system he had taken from another car. He used an automatic bleeding machine to fill the brake system with oil and expel the air. After that, he installed the oil cooler and transmission, filled the engine with new oil, and finally he tried to start it. To his surprise, it started on the first try. He was so incredulous that he stopped and started it again. The engine sounded very smooth, with no knocking or problems, despite the fire that had occurred. After that, he enthusiastically installed the rest of the suspension, the shocks, control arms, and CV joints. He installed the lower control arms and side skirts, and finally, he installed the new taillights. For safety, he of course installed the airbags for the seats. The roof was painted in the car's color with blue and yellow stripes to match the interior upholstery. The rear bumper was installed with a carbon fiber diffuser, and the front and rear windows and triangles were added. Then the rear seats were installed, and the rest of the interior upholstery was completed. They used an old burnt-out mirror as a memento, and surprisingly, its turn signal worked. The driver's side door panel was repaired, and he traveled specifically to get an original transmission control unit because the new transmission wouldn't start. After that, he changed and filled the transmission and engine oil, and also replaced the oil filter. He installed the entire exhaust system, followed by the new radiators. Here, he repaired the electrical wiring harness which had been broken, using new clips. We see him here installing the hood, fenders, and front bumper to test the measurements after they replaced the front chassis. Everything fit perfectly, without any modifications, which is a great achievement because the chassis work was very extensive. Finally, they consulted an expert. He programmed it to reprogram all the new control units because the screens and information system weren't working at all. The car wouldn't shift gears at all, so they discovered that the transmission fluid was low and needed to be topped up. While the engine was running and they were adding coolant, they discovered leaks, so they had to take the entire front of the car apart again and replace the radiators with new ones. Here, we reach the point where he made a custom dashboard in a new color. Then he installed the wiring harness and the dashboard himself, and it definitely took him time to make sure that every wire was in its place. He cleaned and painted the brake calipers with a glossy blue color to match the overall look. After that, he installed large carbon fiber parts like the hood cover, fender, side skirts, and spoiler. All these parts were not original at all. They all came from China. But the installation was very difficult and required modifications to make the parts fit correctly. In the end, he chose to install gold-colored brake pads. So we have almost finished the entire restoration journey. This story was completely unexpected. At first, he was only going to fix the dent, but suddenly he found himself repairing the car after it caught fire. Of course, it's not 100% finished yet. He still has some good work to do, but Joe himself stopped filming the competition car and started focusing on his channel because this repair process took him almost 6 months. Every time he tries to fix something or improve something, he finds another problem. As we've seen in the few instances, fire repairs are like a vicious cycle that can drain time and money almost indefinitely. So, thank you so much, Sheila, if you've made it this far. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which burnt car you'd like to see repaired here. That's all for now.